Lep pozdrav, želim vsem Okay, so now it is time to jump into Benin issue and of course English. So now we will talk about the book itself and the topics brought by Danom Hicksom to wider public, and maybe we can start with the city of Benin and the place and the occasion in which, of course, Dan was the one who decided to write about it. So maybe you can reply directly to Benin issue for the beginning.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I guess first off, I'd like to thank you for inviting me and for hosting me so well here. It's wonderful to be here, and you know, it's interesting how this issue, and actually your friend or your lodger who raises this issue reminds us of how much of an international set of questions this is, and how important it is for the people of Benin City, for Nigerians in Edo States, and more generally in Nigeria, for West Africans in general, and for communities around the world who found themselves on the sharp end of museums, oddly. I mean, who knew museums had a sharp end? We don't think of it like that. It's hard for us to think about our museums and galleries and indeed university disciplines as being things that were bound up with histories of dispossession, but there we go. We have those inheritances, and I think if you want to begin with the question of Benin City, yeah, there's a museum that's being built there, and it's a part of a new genre of museums. You might say we're seeing a similar one that's being built in Athens at the moment. These incredibly future-oriented, hopeful museums that are built to receive items that it's hoped will be returned, and in some cases, in terms of Benin City, have already been, the paperwork has been done, and the returns have been agreed to. So it's a reminder of the fact that while we think of our museums as things that never change, and of course a big part of our role in museums is to make sure that things don't change in some ways. In some ways the role of the curator is akin to that of the conservator. We have to make sure that the moths aren't eating the fabrics and the rust isn't eating away at the metalwork, but that doesn't mean that we can stop the world from changing around us, or indeed that we have to hold on to only one inherited model of what a museum can be. So what's happening right now in Benin City is that you're seeing one example of something that's going on around the world, a reimagination of what museums can be, from which we can learn in Europe, and a conversation that we have to be part of, and part of, for us, in the European context, who work in museums, but also those of us who work more generally in art and culture, anthropology, archaeology, architectural history, because this is about monuments and memory as well. These are also things that we can think hard about how we change our institutions and our ways of working, because we're inheriting certain things from the past, and we also can think about where we are going to be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. I've talked about the 2020s as a decade of returns. We are in a very unique historical period where we are seeing in this 10-year period, and we're right in the middle of it now, that shift and evolution in the curatorial professional practice of museums, but also that's part of a much wider social shift, a shift in the memory culture of Europe, where we are remembering forms of colonialism that we were taught to forget, and that reached into all sorts of parts of Europe that we forget about. So we're learning from conversations that are understood within Benin City and the Nigerian wider diaspora are things that are being shown to us in museums. That's happening across many cultures, but the Benin City, arguments and that historical consciousness is something that we're learning from.
I was actually thinking about the initial impulse you had in Benin City when the representatives of the local initiatives, museum initiatives, and of course British Museum staff and your Pitt Rivers Museum met and discussed issues for the future, related of course to colonial heritage.
Sure, absolutely. So back in 2019, absolutely, it was conversations in Benin City that spurred me to write the book, and to write it really fast actually. I've been thinking about it for a while, but I sat down and wrote it in 6 months really, intensely, doing not much else, because of a promise I made to some of my Nigerian colleagues and friends when I was in Benin City in July of 2019 as a part of a series of conversations that were happening in something called the Benin Dialogue Group. A couple of years ago, a South African a colleague of mine said to me that colonialism used to be that you tell me that you're inferior, that I'm inferior to you. Today, colonialism is that you tell me that we're in a dialogue. And that idea of dialogue, conversations, these histories are entangled, but we're going to talk about them. And actually sort of talk it out, to kick the can down the road, to sort of talk so much that everyone gets so exhausted that everything seems so complicated by the end of all these conversations that nothing ever changes. Sarah Ahmed, the wonderful writer on these issues, calls it, she borrows a term from Butler, Judith Butler, and she expands it. She talks about non-performativity. And non-performativity is what institutions do when they have meetings about anti-racism or addressing inequalities in relation to gender or sexuality or whatever, and they have so many meetings and they come together and they write papers and so on, but nothing changes. And the purpose of all the light and heat is that nothing will change. So that was for me how the question of dialogue felt, and for many involved in those dialogues how it felt, because sometimes dialogue has to give way to action, but also sometimes dialogue can hear so many balance sheet approaches, so many sides of the equation, that things that are simply untrue are put forward. Old untruths are repeated. One thing we're dealing with these histories are that the propaganda was written at the time. There were the accounts that people rely on for the Benin expedition were written by the chief intelligence officer for the Benin expedition in 1897. They had an intelligence officer at that time. There were journalists on the spot writing it up for, the writings up of what was going on in West Africa by the Times and by the Illustrated London News were deeply involved, in the corporate colonial militarist, project. The reason to write, I was just hearing people lying to each other. And thought, well, it's time to actually, I know a little bit about this, and I've worked in the Pitt Rivers. At that point, I've now worked there 18 years, and I'd seen how much our audiences, our stakeholders, our wider communities had changed in how they interacted with not only the Benin bronzes, but also other objects that were taken with violence, or objects where there is a demand for a return, or where that conversation hasn't even started. So I wanted to make an intervention fundamentally to break down this fake balance between, on the one side, restitution, something that the descendant groups want, and the curators, who are the experts, understand could really never happen. That was already changing in the atmosphere, because the majority of people in my sector understand that restitution is a normal part of our activity. I'm old enough to remember when the very different questions over the return of Nazi looted art between 1933 and 1945 were controversial, and we were told 30 or 40 years ago, well, if you return to descendants what was stolen from their ancestors, then this object will not be in the museum, or they might sell it, or they might hide it away. It will be looked after properly. Yes, it's their object, they do what they want. Of course, you return it. It's now uncontroversial. For human remains, that used to be a controversial issue in our museum sector, that you would want to hold on to these things, these ancestors that were seen as things, seen as scientific specimens. That's now a normal part of our museum practice, that we return when we have, on a case-by-case basis, when understanding can be done and working with the descent communities happens, and where it's asked for in the first place, that's now normal. So yeah, the purpose of the book really was to break down that and to say, we understand restitution as a normal part of our work in those other very different circumstances. Of course we can do it, but on a case-by-case basis for African material culture. And the Benin expedition is such an obvious example, because there is a light demand, and there has been for 100 years. And they took photographs of themselves as they were doing the looting. I mean, you couldn't ask for better historical evidence of what went on either.
So the chapters in the book are related actually to activities which were basically looting activities and contextualization in historical shifts of colonialism and colonial rule in this, let's say, high or late phase of colonialism itself. But before we will go to violence and looting itself, I would like to ask you, because you're an anthropologist and archaeologist at the same time, which is a pretty much specific British school of relationship between archaeology and anthropology. And I guess your view on artifacts itself is a bit specific and different from the views art historians might have.
Yeah, I mean, I rather like the anthropologist Tim Ingold's account of what he calls the 4 A's, because I think it maps quite well onto what I feel I do, or what I found myself doing in my academic writing and career, but also I think an entity that is quite significant in the history of anthropology in the British tradition. The 4 A's, for those of you that don't know Tim's work, are archaeology, anthropology, art and architecture. And they do fit together in terms of what anthropology, how anthropology was created in the later 19th century. E.B. Tyler was the first professor of anthropology in the world. He was at the Pitt Rivers Museum. Augustus Pitt Rivers, after whom the museum is named, wrote, and I wrote about this in Current Anthropology 10 years ago, drew out a diagram of what essentially is the so-called 4-field model of anthropology that American anthropology uses, which includes linguistics and physical anthropology alongside ethnology and archaeology. So you have got an interesting entangled history, which of course our museums were built in some ways to make last. So across Europe, across the world, one thing we all share in common is that anthropology to some degree deserted the museum at some point in the 20th century. They became embarrassing relics of the past that was nothing to do with the new version of anthropology on a sociological model, on a Durkheimian model, on a Levi-Straussian model that we might have wanted to, on a more abstract, theoretical model, something that we do in the libraries and in the field, but not in the museum. That became incredibly important over the course of the 20th century. But today, I think our museums are spaces that can be really important as the public spaces for anthropology. Of course, they're full of these inheritances, but they're also full of all possibility as well. Intellectually, it's that Anglo-American link in between these disciplines. But definitely, I think the thing about Arc and Anth, as we call it at undergraduate level in Oxford, archaeology and anthropology, that was how I was trained as an undergraduate. It was a joint honours degree, is that, it's where those two fields meet, is where, when does something become archaeological? Where do you draw the line in between humans and objects, in between the past and the present? I mean, that's what's being worked out in our museums. And of course, in the case of it's an argument that without that training, I wouldn't have been able to make the argument I make in the book about the chrono-political, the use of time for the purposes of politics that happened in the museum. So when they looted the Benin bronzes, within weeks these objects were on display in the British Museum, in Oxford and elsewhere. And in the British Museum, they were put on display in the Assyrian saloon. They were put next to objects from ancient Egypt and from the Bronze Age of the Middle East, of the Near East. So the sort of propaganda was obvious from the start. We can appreciate this art, but we have blown this culture back into the Bronze Age. That was the story. So it's the use to put objects of a living culture where you've just desecrated the palaces and the religious sites and allowed 200 sailors and soldiers and administrators in a chaotic free-for-all to take what they could for personal gain, to sell them to museums. You allowed that to happen. And then in the museum in London, you then show these objects as if it's the past, as if it's archaeology. That is a use of archaeology for the purposes of the present. But it's also one that I personally, as someone that works in this field, I'm really upset about. That archaeology gets misused like that. We're very used to the idea that it was misused under fascism in the 20th century, that archaeology was put to work in all sorts of ways. We're less familiar with the idea that was happening in the 19th century as well. So it's understanding those histories and being ready to address them that was a part of that. Yeah.
So we now touched the most important part of the story, which is how these items and artifacts came to Great Britain and Europe. They are now widespread all around Europe and the world. Actually, we have a very precise list of locations of Benin bronzes. But let's go back to the end of the 19th century, into 1897-98, when all these atrocities happened. It was a part of a business, wasn't it?
Yeah, so one of the things that's a challenge, and one thing that the book seeks to challenge us all to do, is to be a bit more precise when we use this word colonialism. We often use it in, certainly in the UK context or North American context, we use it with a sort of generality, as if the colonialisms of the 17th century were the same as the 20th century. And of course, I'm of a generation that was taught in the 1990s that we were in something called a post-colonial society, which I have to say, you just have to open a newspaper or doom scroll your social media to realise that it becomes increasingly hard to hold on to the idea that all forms of colonialism, I mean, from Ukraine, to Gaza, it's hard to think that there's no vestige of the colonial left in the world. So what that means is we have to be a bit better at precision when it comes to forms of colonialism. And of course we think of settler colonialism as one form, but this book is about something that I didn't really know existed, and we don't really have a good word for. I use all sorts of hyphenated terms, the corporate, militarist, extractivist colonialisms that we're talking about. But really these are not, looting in this context is not something that European nations were doing in the crown colonies that they settled. The British were in Lagos as a crown colony, but they weren't looting Lagos. Looting as a military tactic was about making claims to sovereignty, seeking to destroy traditional religion, seeking to produce a sort of cultural ground zero, a dispossession, a destruction of culture that was on the edges of empire. It was something that happened on company land or on the edges of company land. It was something that happened hand in hand with this idea of the protectorate. And there's something about that notion of the protectorate as an entity, a form of informal empire or gentlemanly capitalism, as sometimes the historians in the past have called it, that was really a question of protecting, like the mafia protects you. You're not really being protected. And then weirdly that language finds its way into museums, that we're protecting the objects that came from the protectorate where we actually destroyed everything. So, you know, to destroy and to desecrate religious sites or royal sites and to take those objects away was about seeking to destroy power as well as hand in hand with art and culture and to lay claim to it. So yeah, what that book and actually what my next book, which is out in May, sort of takes forward more is let's get a bit more refinement and detail. Let's think ethnologically, anthropologically, historically in more detail about the different forms of empire, not least because some forms of empire were so deterritorialised they reached all the way to the centre of London in the form of the British Museum. Or, in fact, more accurately, they sort of colonised the British Museum. They colonised the museum itself, because museums have a long history. People have all, we need museums. We love museums. Museums are forms of assembling objects of things that all societies have done in different ways. The museum was put to work in a very specific sort of time frame in between the 1870s, 1880s and the 1930s. So yeah, we just need to look at that history and realise that these forms of colonialism are things we're only just at the beginning of understanding. But our museums, it turns out, one of the value of our ethnological museums is they're these incredible indexes, to those histories. These histories that were written up as propaganda at the time, that were justified, where art and culture were used to justify extreme violence because of the idea that not all cultures are equal, and therefore it's okay to go and sort of destroy because of a cultural argument. That's all those arguments are preserved in the form of objects in our museums. So one way to understand our museums and to think about museums in some ways as sites of conscience is to understand those histories.
Yeah, definitely. So we came to the point from which, I have only two questions more, and later we will give the floor to audience and colleagues to ask a writer about the book and the issues related to it. The first one is obviously political. If we are trying to understand what was going on in the past, then we have to have a clear political stance, and you definitely had a kind of a clear example in which you could have dug into the roots of something we understand as colonial violence, which was civilized colonial violence in its essence, and of course technically possible at that time with advantage of weapons used in the field. Everything is clearly shown in this horrible example of looting of the Benin city. So how you relate your own professional attitude, ethical attitude, and political views?
So I think I came to understand my positionality in the way that we used to be encouraged to do so, to be reflexive, to think about the situated nature of my knowledge, not simply by putting it forward and saying, here's my privilege, here's where I'm writing from, but in some ways actually to wish to dismantle some of that infrastructure that makes that all possible, and some of the privilege. So I think there is a shift in the way that we think about the politics of what we do academically, which has to be more than just the land acknowledgement as they do in North America, or the statement of here's my privilege, here's the cis masculinity, here's the whiteness, here's the privilege of the institution. In this case, here's the privileged access to knowledge, which is a big part of the privilege here. But I can't just do that and then reflexively somehow represent myself. No, that's okay. Well, happy that's out of the way. Now we can just carry on as usual. Not least because sometimes to state your privilege is to actually remind people of it and underline it and enhance it in some ways. So the politics starts with how do we think about the nature of the professional and the political in these times. I think for me, you know, it has to begin with your expertise, and in my case that, as we've heard, was archaeology and anthropology. So simply the coincidence of 1884 as the year of the Berlin Congress, as the year of the invention of the Maxim machine gun, and of the year of the foundation of the museum in which I work, seemed quite important as a set of things that I was inheriting all at once, you know, all these years later. So the politics for me is, I mean, the Germans have this term, Erinnerungskultur, memory culture, which was a powerful model until it sort of broke in the past 2 years or so. It's in flux in all sorts of interesting ways, this notion of memory, and the arguments are being put, well, whose memory? Should everyone share the same memory? What is public memory in those ways? What was interesting about the German case was there was an ability to begin to move from the legacies of the communist era and from the Nazi era and to add the third leg of the stool, which was the colonial era. And in fact, I mean, what the Germans ended up doing was to lead the coming to terms with the British colonial past from Berlin rather than from London. It was an interesting process that happened. But you know, there are many other forms of doing memory culture, and I think you can do it. You can see, for those of us who work in historical disciplines, for those of us who resist, though, that idea, the old idea that history is about how it really was, rather than about, you know, being a form of memory, being a form of, you know, writing about what's important in the present. Yeah, we can reinvent that, and I think we have to do it more than anything in these times, because of this thing that the hard right are calling the culture war, which actually, as the book argues, has a long history. And the weaponization of culture, the weaponization of our museums hasn't come out of nowhere. You know, this isn't a new thing. The idea that our museums are told that they should never change is because, for a short period of their time, they were put to work in order to tell a series of stories that somebody wanted never to change, and to hardwire those social attitudes or those prejudices into museums or art or statues and monuments or into the books on the shelves of the library is incredibly powerful as a way to do it, because, of course, it's incredibly hard to change those things. That doesn't, though, mean that we can't reimagine our museums as something other than a one-way street. We have to reimagine our museums not as the places where objects are set to die and to sit there. We have, fundamentally, the politics for me starts with what I did at the back, which has been superseded since by the very good work of the Digital Benin project. Let's be transparent about where these objects are. If we can do it for Benin City, we can do it for every other object. Why do we not have full databases for everything in all of our museums in Europe, when the British Museum was found impossibly to be stealing from itself in 2023? The reason that that was possible was because it doesn't have, as so many other museums don't, it doesn't have an accurate, transparent, public-facing database of its 8 or perhaps 9 million, I mean, what's a million objects here or there? 8 or 9, I mean, we don't even have a number for how many objects are in the British Museum. You know, that, and if we can't do it for the best funded, most high profile and self-aggrandizing in terms of its so-called universalism, you know, then of course you're not going to do it for underfunded regional museums where the focus always has to be on the next exhibition that might engage the audiences and to bring in the money rather than the boring old work on working out what on earth is in the stores. But these things are being looked after with public money, with taxpayers' money, with the money of institutions like universities. So we need that transformation. We need the investment in understanding transparency, and once those numbers are out there, we need an openness to returning on a case-by-case basis. People can't ask for things back if they don't know what's in them. You're in the museum, they don't know that these objects exist in the first place. But also, we will then understand everything that's in the museum, the vast majority of which nobody wants to move from A to B at all. And we can actually see our museums like libraries. We can see them as research facilities, and we can allow the role of the curator to be something other than the librarian who wants to be the person that writes all the books, but instead introduces other writers into the museum to maximise the potential of these incredible collections that we have. Some of the stories are going to be difficult, and sometimes we're going to have to dismantle things and to give back what was taken. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing this. So I'm hoping that a part of the legacy of this book is it's a part of this unfolding of what, and refocusing on these incredibly important institutions, our ethnological, world culture, anthropological museums.
Yeah, so these are issues, I guess, will come further from the discussion we will have with our audience. I did not want specifically to touch these parts of our interest or common interest in rethinking the role of museums in general. My last question will be for you about the book itself and its, let's say, afterlife or life in its essence. So how to say it, the responses you've got from the public in Great Britain and around the world, and of course your plans for the future. You already mentioned your book, which is practically ready to be published in later part of this year. Related again in May.
It's a nice day to publish a book.
About monuments and human remains.
My last book was out on fireworks night on the 5th of November, as we bonfire night as we have in Britain. And the next one's out on May Day, so let's see.
Okay, we shall see. So the life of the book is always something you can't predict when you finish it. So what happened?
Exactly. So I published the book with a very wonderful small leftist press in London, which we've heard about already, Pluto Press. If anyone who doesn't know them as a publisher, look them up. They have all sorts of schemes to subscribe to. They always have a 40% offer on it seems on something or another. But do think of publishing with them as well. It was a fantastic experience, and a very different one to the equally fantastic experience of working with Penguin for the next book. I mean, they couldn't be more different as publishers. But yeah, I'm excited to be working. I've been very privileged to work with both. So you never know. I mean, I'm an academic. I'm used to writing sort of papers that for 4 people and a dog might read. But this one touched a nerve. I mean, it reminds you that you can you can learn from audiences and from publics, from students, from movements that are happening around institutions in which you work. And a part of it was the Rose Must Fall in Oxford and the wider movement for Black Lives that we saw happening in Oxford from 2015 to 16 onwards. But also, the hilarious thing was some of the right-wing sort of press attempted to say that this book had been written in a response to the events of the summer of 2020, when of course it was handed over a few weeks before lockdown in the February of 2020, because for some on the right, they didn't want to accept that the civil rights movement has a long history. Of course, it came into a new phase with the Black Lives Matter movement in 2015 to 16 onwards. But that was part of a long-term set of campaigns, and of course for the Benin bronzes, the demands have been going on for years. The funny thing is that we think of, every time we come to a topic like restitution, I'm sure there are people in this room that are working on topics where the same kind of thing happens, especially if they're around institutions like museums or heritage. Every time we come to a question, it's like we have to go back to first principles. It becomes an ethical question, a philosophical question. Should an object go back to where it originally was? All that sort of thing, as if we've never had this conversation before. And every 25 years or so, we stage those conversations. One of the bits of hope I've had, I'm answering this question about the afterlife of the book by looking at its sort of its ante-life, its sort of pre-life, its conception, I guess. The legacy, or I guess the tradition within it was, within which it was written, which is how I'd rather put it, maybe, because there is a long history of this work, but every time we come to those issues, we're told we have to think about them as first principles. So we have to do. If you find yourself in that position, you have to understand the history of those movements, but you also have to listen. I mean, when you've got, as we had at various points, when you've got the protesters actually outside the museum, who are making a connection, in our case between a statue of Cecil John Rhodes of the British South Africa Company and the Benin bronzes that were taken as part of the history of the Royal Niger Company, all in the later 19th century, then you have to actually think about, well, what's the history of here? History of protest, history of resistance, and so on. So one of the surprises of the book was not really simply that people read it, and even though it was published by this tiny press, it was written about in the New York Times and the New York Review of Books, and it was one part of a set of interventions that helped to change the sort of policy of institutions around the world. One of the surprises was really how much of the pushback I got, and I got pushback. I mean, I lost as many friends as I gained. I gained far more interesting friends than I lost in some ways, but I did lose. I mean, there were some institutions, and it's a great sadness for me that there are some institutions where the phone, they don't pick up the phone anymore. I won't mention them, but you can read in the preface to the book some of the hit jobs that were done on me, not by what you'd expect, the usual right-wing sort of commentators that don't know anything about the topic, but from some senior leadership figures who have chosen, they've picked their generation, they've picked, they're going to take a position that was held in the 1990s or the 1980s rather than the position that's emerging in the new generation. So more than anything, I've made a film when I was a Julian, something that would never have happened, be a major filmmaker artist in the UK. Equally, I have recently been invited to give a talk at the Victorian Albert Museum. I think I know which of those two things I'm, happier with. And actually, I think there's a maturity now where, the book was seen by some as an attack on museums. I've always argued the purpose of the book was to try and save museums from their history and just, let's allow ourselves to change. I think that's softening. I think, that we're now seeing an acceptance that the world does sort of change, and hopefully, who knows, maybe the call from the Victorian Albert Museum will come someday. Big, because they're my friends and colleagues, and you don't want to lose colleagues and friends over simply trying to tell the truth.
Let's not lose hope for change. Now I'm opening the floor for your interventions, questions, whatever comes, and maybe you and Liliana, if you as people who were involved in publishing the translation have anything more to add or to put forward. So the discussion is open.
While people are thinking, if I could just add my note of thanks to all involved in the publication and the translation process. I'm told, I'm afraid my language skills are inadequate to, make that, that verdict myself. But I'm told that the translation is wonderful and is a wonderful thing to read. Better than the original, which is always what you want. It's always what you want with the translation. And so thank you to everyone that made it happen. And obviously it's a weird thing to be, talking about the translation of the last book at the point at which Every Monument Will Fall, my next book, is out on the 1st of May, and I'm in the middle of the indexing for that. But there's this I was saying earlier, there's this wonderful book by a woman called Kate, whose name is, I told you her name earlier, Kate Rinks, who translated Roland Barthes and wrote a wonderful book about translation called This Little Art. And she makes the point, which I think Bart makes as well, about the weird sort of time warps that happen with translation. We think, I mean, I read Bart and think as if, you know, there's a book that was written in 1976 and it comes out in English in 1988. I think of it as a book that, that's from 1988. You get these interesting warps of time in the translation of language, and of course the words are different, but the time changes happen. And for a book like this, which is about time, which is about the work of museums, there's a lovely parallel in between the fact that this book is a new book now, yet again, and that's the work of translation. Maybe all of us are involved in different ways in trying to translate the past or to translate other cultures, and maybe we can learn something from the work of the translator.
Yes.
You mentioned a bit earlier that you work with audiences as well as a curator in the museum, and the audience has changed in about 18 years. Could you maybe speak a little bit about how, if you have noticed it, how this book has had an impact on the museum audiences actually?
Yes, it has. I mean, I'm very pleased to say that the book is now on sale at the British Museum. There's a new director of the British Museum, and he instructed the poor people who work at the bookshop. Apparently, within the museum, they're known as the higher ups. So whoever's in charge of the poor people who work at the bookshop had said, "You can't stop. We're not going to carry this awful book. This is wrong. This is." Anyway, as of September last year, the British Museum are selling it. So you've now got people who can visit the British Museum and can buy the book and can read the book while they're walking around it. And that's nice. That's exactly as it should be. So people have. I mean, the surprising thing is, people have read it, and I'm always amazed. And it's found its way onto reading lists. So there's a new generation of undergraduates and master's students who are now moving into PhDs who, that was on their course, and that's a weird thing and an exciting thing, to be able to, to write a book that fills a gap of that sort, which is so important for training the next, generation. I think the thing that, that people, it's added a bit of. It's a bit of a relief, I think, for some people that it's one example among many of the fact that people in museums are happy to be open and transparent about their histories. There's always a risk when you tell these stories that you're going to re-inscribe that violence. And that was something I thought about a lot as I was writing the book, because remember, the signs that say these objects were looted in an attack upon the palace of Benin, in which the king of Benin was deposed, etc., etc. They were there right from the start. The whole purpose of the putting of these objects on display, arguably the whole purpose of the looting exercise and the involvement of the free market, of the art market in that, was in order to tell the story of the defeat of the ogre in a museum in London. So for me to write a book that just repeats it is, could be even worse. It could just make it worse. And I think I got the balance right in that, and I haven't heard that from anyone, but it was something I was worried about when I was writing. I thought a lot about you have to be careful about how you tell the stories, and there were some ways in which, the line in between the brutality and the, I've never actually burst into tears while writing, apart from when writing this book. It happened on a couple of occasions, because some of the detail, when you're reading it in the primary documents, and you're trying to get it down on paper, and it's so horrible, is incredibly upsetting. And you want to be, you don't want to have to write a trigger warning. You don't want to be making those histories worse by rewriting them or reenacting them. But equally, it's a story that has to be told. But ultimately, audiences are going to make up their own mind, and the fact that we've now got something other than just rewriting the label, we've actually got the removal of objects from collections and their return on a case-by-case basis is incredibly incredibly right. We can reimagine what our World Cultural Museums are, and I think our audiences are hopefully hand in hand with this. Even the old guard, even the people that love, the British Museum or the British Museum because their, grandfather was a colonial officer who, brought back objects in the 1920s. And in the UK, maybe here, I don't know, in the UK there's a surprising number of those people. Because of course, these were big operations, as we were saying. It wasn't, this was World War Zero. There were a lot of people involved in that World War. And weirdly, the memorials are not in the streets, they're in the museums. And the little handwritten labels in the Pitt Rivers Museum that say this was given by Colonel whoever in 1905, that's a sort of a memorial, to that person. It's a form of memory culture. So but even those families, even those sort of descendants, there's even Mark Walker writing the book, and this reminds us how near these histories are. He is the grandson of Walker, who was the man that was one of the officers in this expedition. He took objects, he inherited them, the grandson inherited them, he personally returned them to the Ogler back in the late 2010s. So some of the descendants, of course, are absolutely right. Love their grandfather, but happy to return what he nicked. So you'd be surprised. I think that you've just got, sometimes things that are wrong persist in plain sight for a certain amount of time, kind of unseen, sort of tacit, hardwired into our culture in a way that no one ever, it'd be very hard to ever sort of question them. But then as people do question them again and again over time, they do start to fall. Sometimes you don't see it. There are objects, the Benin bronzes were already in part being returned in the 1990s. I think that's the really good news part of this, is that when there are campaigns about the change for cultural institutions, when there are movements of this kind, they take about 50 years or even longer sometimes. It takes 50, I lived in Bristol in the 1990s, and the communities there were calling for the removal of Edward Colston, the famous statue of the 17th century slave trader who was erected in 1895 and fell, of course, in 2020. What's interesting about the erection of that statue is that it was 1895, the same, just a couple of years before the Benin attack, and these regimes of violence and visuality and the putting of art history and museums to work for these ideologies were linked in those ways. In my next book, I give a name to that art movement, which I won't tell you today. I try to name this. It's an unseen art movement that we sort of know it when we see it. This, whether it's a Confederate statue of a guy with a gun, or whether it's a looted object in a museum, or it's a reimagining to celebrate the slave trader on the docks of Bristol.
In any case,
what's exciting is that he was falling already. That was the point. So in the 1990s, there was the campaign for Colston to go. It took 50 years, but he was in some ways already falling, and that's the topic of the next book.
And the point was, of course, Dan will give a talk at 6 p.m. Exactly on restitution.
You can hear it all over again.
So this is the reason why I was intervening now, and hopefully we will meet at 6 at Faculty of Arts.
With apologies again for anything that I am going to repeat myself. Yes. But there's always a lot more as well.
Okay, just one more question. You mentioned your new book, 3 months. Obviously, this book was successful, personal success as a writer, and one of the proof is that the next book is going to be published with Penguin.
Yeah.
And renominated publishing house. So, what else do you have already the title, and can you tell us something more about the book? I'm asking as a reader and also as a publisher.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So the next book is called Every Monument Will Fall. If you Google it, you can find it on the Penguin site. The book after that is about this idea of World War Zero that I introduced, which I'm just starting on working on that. I introduced it in the British Museums, and that's also for Penguin. So that's in sort of preparation. But yeah, what I've been pushed to do, because I've been edited in a very different way than Penguin. As a writer, it's been a very, very different experience. And I've been edited incredibly. I was edited very well at Pluto, but they're relatively hands-off. They're just, go for it. Whereas at Penguin, we did structural edits. I had 2 editors. They pushed me very much, not what you would think for a trade publisher. They pushed me much more towards the experimental end of how are you going to write about these histories, how are you going to write yourself into it. There's a lot of use of the vocative, so addressing a second person in the book is one of the characteristics of it. Things like that were just really careful edits and really thoughtful people to work with. Just completely different books, but you'll see when it comes out what you make of it. But it's similar themes addressed in different ways, hopefully addressed for wider audiences. And this was a campaigning book. I mean, this book was about seeking to address one issue and to see change. The next book, it does touch on issues of human remains. It does talk about how we treat ancestral bones in our institutions, but it's about far more than that. Fundamentally, it's about ideas of memory and how to remember and how to forget, and who we remember and who we forget, and why. So in that respect, it builds naturally on this, but it maybe takes it somewhere else.
Is it also going to be academic book, or maybe for
very much for a wider trade audience, but not holding back, a bit like this one. I mean, there is theory. There's Walter Benjamin makes an appearance or two. There's quite a lot of Karl Marx, and even Hannah Arendt at one point. So there's Aimé Césaire and all sorts of Levi-Strauss, in fact, all sorts of people, and a nice bit on the Sarah Arment arguments over non-performativity. So it doesn't shy away from the intellectual stuff. And I don't know, who knows if that works. I think it works. It's the kind of book I wish existed, which is more readability mixed in with theory. And the sort of book I used to, I mentioned Roland Barthes earlier. There was a genre of sort of French writing, and actually anthropology was very important for this, with Levi-Strauss and so on. I'm not comparing myself to those people, but that genre of writing, where you were not afraid to try and write for a wider public, but introduce complex and serious ideas, and to treat the reader as someone that has read stuff and is thoughtful and intelligent. That's what.
And it's hard to do.
It's incredible. It took me 4 years, And who knows if I managed it? But no, it is hard, But also it needs the publishers to believe in it as well.
Yeah.
And so you need the role of the editor is so important.
Any more interaction?
Did the book change the political view on that problem? Because this process is going on for a long time, and museums are generally very highly assumed as trustful institutions, morally, ethically, and opening these problems and this issue it was quite painful, not just for British museums but also in Europe, in many of them. Speaking loudly about these problems, of course, which are not only the matter of the museum, but it's also the matter of the political statement and preparedness, because it's not only one in this dialogue, it's in fact 3 or even more actors in this game. Is it more positive impact on the politics or response?
It's a really, really important question. I'll try to be brief, but it is super important. Obviously, the thing that put this issue on the map was the intervention of Macron. So you have a centrist approach to these issues that didn't shy away from thinking about those issues. There's a lot of literature now emerging on what are the memory politics of Lacan, but that was an indication that this is a topic that some politicians are not going to be afraid of. They might be, in some cases, it might be that the politicians are interested in restitution as a way to instrumentalise the museum in a different way, a sort of soft diplomacy. And we can argue about, we can talk about, the rights and wrongs of that, and whether restitution, as I've argued, should be more something that also has, it's not just the procedure or the diplomacy, it's about the politics of the past and of memory. But you have seen a really fundamental shift in the trustee bodies' positions. I mean, the fact that Oxford University and Cambridge University as trustee bodies made the decision not only to return the Benin bronzes, but to adopt the formal procedure for here's how you make further claims. That's big for institutions like Oxford, and Oxford and Cambridge are not alone. This has happened across Arts Council England in the UK, which is the sort of the arm's length sort of body for government. I mean, they adopted a procedure for restitution, a formal written procedure that other museums can follow. You've seen it obviously in the German case, all of the politics around Humboldt Forum, but also actually restitution as well being led, by the culture minister. So yeah, we're in this. It's all to play for, and as the book says, we don't know how this ends. Part of the point about museums is they're unended stories because they are technologies of duration. Fundamentally, the medium of the politics of the museum is time, because it makes things last. That's what a museum does. That's how it works. So I think it's a very positive picture at the moment. I think in the UK, you've had an increasing isolated position from Westminster, from the government that we no longer have, who were desperate to fight a culture war. In the regions, in the devolved regions in Edinburgh, Belfast, and in Cardiff, completely different conversations. In the regional parts of the UK, in York or in Newcastle or in Liverpool, completely different conversations as compared to London. So you've seen London and New York holding out because of the art market, really, and because of all sorts of conservatism, really, hammered into the cultural sector in those locations, holding out against these issues. But that's fading now as well. So I think, we're winning, and I think this year has felt, the past sort of 12 months has felt that we've seen involvement from politicians in a very open way, far more. And so I think we will see more happening.
Yeah, so we have touched important general issues now at the end. I have to say that my expectations for this conversation were that it would be a bit shorter. we are much above the foreseen time of it, but let's say we have one last chance for possible intervention from the audience if needed. Otherwise, I'm very pleased to say that this part of the discussion is over, and I'm very thankful for you all surviving it, and of course thank you for the participants of the talk.